This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. And I called this a podcast, but eventually we'll be also YouTube TV, and some of you may see us there. And I want to thank those folks who have helped keep us on the air by their contributions. And if anybody wants to contribute, we are not a nonprofit. It's not a donation, but a contribution. Go to spiritmatterstalk.com and click on the red button.
It's not red, Dennis, it's a button.
The button. Our guest today, Craig Hamilton. He is a pioneer in the emerging field of evolutionary spirituality and a leading voice in the movement for conscious evolution. A guiding force behind Integral Enlightenment, Craig offers spiritual guidance and teachings to a growing international community spanning 85 countries. He is known worldwide, and we are very thankful, Craig, for you taking the time to come on with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you guys. And Phil and I go back quite a ways, and you and I are just meeting. And great to jump in and talk about higher things.
Craig, fill our listeners and now viewers in on some of your spiritual background. If you could give us the short version of, how you came to your spiritual path and what led to the work you've been doing.
How long is short version?
25 words or less.
Minutes?
No, about 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah.
2 or 3 minutes. Okay.
And then we'll elaborate on. We'll continue.
Yeah, sure. Well, the past is never as interesting as the present or the future. But let's see. So I guess what I would say in a few minutes is that I, like many of us, I began to feel a spiritual longing. I wasn't raised in a religious family at all. I was raised secular Unitarian, I would call it. But in my teens, I started to really feel that there was something deeper and something more. And I started taking up meditation practices when I was around 16. And that all came to me from the East. I read a lot of Eastern books and practiced a lot of Eastern meditation initially, and started to have a series of spiritual experiences also in my late teens that kind of continued to intensify as I approached my 20s. And by the time I was in my 20s, I had basically decided that my life was about my spiritual awakening, and I was giving myself to it wholeheartedly, however that was going to unfold. And I spent a lot of time in my 20s traveling in the East. I spent time in monasteries in Thailand meditating. I spent time in India doing intensive meditation retreats in a variety of different traditions, and kind of reached a point where I started to sense that as much as we had to learn from the traditions, which was a lot, because I found traditional spirituality very profound. I was religious studies major in college and studied a lot of Eastern religion and was very passionate about it all. And but I just started to feel like there was maybe a more scientific, a more exploratory, investigative, experimental way to approach the spiritual path than just taking everything from the traditions at face value. And that essentially led me into a series of what I've come to call evolutionary laboratories or spiritual laboratories, which were really contexts here in the West where people, and when I say laboratory, there are real meditation laboratories now where people are in lab coats putting electrodes on your head. I don't mean those. But what I mean are essentially contexts where people come together to do intensive spiritual practice and really compare notes and say, well, what do you experience? What am I experiencing? How does this really work? Let's compare it to what the traditions tell us, but let's also be phenomenologists. Let's look at our own experience. And, and I began to find that a lot of people are having awakening experiences. It's actually fairly common that people have spiritual awakenings of various kinds, not just blissful experiences, but profound insight into the nature of reality. And so I know I'm trying to do the short version, out of this sort of experimental spiritual laboratory approach, what I've come to are kind of what I've come to call two kind of pieces of the spiritual path. One is what I call integral enlightenment. The other I call the practice of direct awakening. But what they both have in common is that they're really trying to reverse engineer awakened consciousness and turn it into a practice, as opposed to, I'm going to practice things that maybe someday will, prepare me to have an awakening experience out in the future, and then maybe something will change. It's much more like we take the kind of wisdom of awakening, the natural ways of being that come from spiritually awakened consciousness, and we put them into practice in our daily lives and in our meditation right now, all with the intent to be awake right now,
Right.
not tomorrow, not in 5 minutes, right now. And anyway, that's kind of been my whole, and that brought that body of work out into the world. And we can talk more about that if you want.
Craig, I wanted to ask
that's
you, you mentioned that it was in your late teens that you sort of, through a series of experiences or whatever, decided to go full force into this. And, but I'm wondering, when you look back on your life, maybe even your childhood, before that period of time, might you have had a spiritual experience, experience of awakening, something that triggered you back then that you couldn't put in any context or didn't know what to make of it? But when you look back, you had an experience like that, and maybe that is what was the seed that began to bloom, blossom in your late teens.
I would say it's a great, very interesting question. I haven't really thought a lot about it, but there are actually two things that come to mind in response. So one is that there was something that started to stir in me probably when I was around 10 or 11, where like my family was really into the outdoors, and I'm grateful for that because I'm really into the great outdoors, and that, I kind of got that from my family in a big way. But I remember when we would sometimes go to a really beautiful place in nature, I had this compulsion to go and sit cross-legged on the edge of a cliff and just look out. And that was not something I got from my family of origin. It was just something in me where I just kind of, I wouldn't call it a spiritual experience per se, but there was some longing for more, some sense of connecting to something bigger that I would do. And when I look back, I guess kind of like you're saying, I kind of think, oh, maybe that was an early stirring, even though I didn't think of it as spiritual. I didn't tie it to religion. There was nothing, didn't have a context for that. The other thing, and I don't know if this is or not, but as a kid, a young kid, I would sometimes have this experience at night, like when I was lying in bed, of what I could only describe as a very intense energy. It didn't even feel necessarily good or bad, but it was a very intense kind of pressure and energy that would kind of come down and and I just remember it was this, other world, like it was out of the paradigm of ordinary consciousness in life. And it was just this thing. And I never talked to my parents about it. I never talked to anybody about it. But so I wonder, and I could say either of those could have been early something.
Glimpses.
Maybe, yeah.
Hints. Craig, on your website, which we should tell people is craighamiltonglobal.com.
That's because I couldn't get craighamilton.com because it's owned by an insurance agency in Canada. Then the partners the last names are Craig and Hamilton.
That's hysterical.
And they're not giving it up.
That's why we are Spirit Matters Talk instead of Spirit Matters. Somebody has Spirit Matters. So on your website, which I encourage all our listeners to visit, there are two courses, and you alluded to them before. One is called The Practice of Direct Awakening, a 12-week, they're both online, of course, and you were doing online courses pre-pandemic, and have been a kind of a pioneer of that. So one is a 12-week course called The Practice of Direct Awakening. The other is Integral Enlightenment. Let's start with the first one, The Practice of Direct Awakening. How would you describe this? What do you mean by direct awakening? What's in the course?
So thanks for that. So the practice of direct awakening is really this idea that I brought up very briefly in my attempt to do a short introduction. And what the idea of direct awakening is, okay, if you think about the spiritual path, how we've been taught it, obviously there's thousands of ways we've all been taught it, but a lot of enlightenment teachings, a lot of teachings that point toward awakening, see it as a practice where you do this technique or that technique. Maybe you're chanting something, or you're visualizing something, or you're following your breath, or platooning to your body, or any number, or labeling every thought and sensation, all the different ways we can meditate. What most of them have in common is that the technique itself doesn't have anything specific to do with spiritual awakening. It's a technique that you're doing in the hope that it might bring you to an awakening. So I'm saying the goal of most spiritual practices is some kind of enlightenment or awakening, but the practices themselves typically are just a practice that someone has determined is going to help, calm your mind, or, resonate you, get you resonant with some higher consciousness or something. But it's all, a lot of it anyway is what I would maybe call an indirect path, in that you do it and eventually it's supposed to open something up. So with the practice of direct awakening, the idea is that, or really the question that drove me to the discovery of it and the teaching of it was could it be possible for us to practice being awake when we meditate? So the practice of direct awakening is a meditation course, and it's an approach to meditation. And there are a whole bunch of different sort of what I would call gateways to awakened consciousness that we practice in it. It's not one thing, it's a dozen things. But what they all have in common is that when you sit down to meditate, what you're sitting down to do is to practice some natural quality or natural, what we might call disposition or character of awakened consciousness. So I'll just give one example to give you a sense of what I mean. So if we think about how is awakened consciousness different than unawakened consciousness? And let's take the Buddha, who said that, unenlightened consciousness, one of the things that characterize it is grasping. We're grasping on, we're holding on. Basically two things, grasping and pushing away. Kind of take the Buddha right down to the simplest. You're either grasping for certain experiences, trying to hold on to positive feelings, and we're pushing away discomfort. And fundamentally, this is a kind of a basic stance of unenlightened consciousness. Enlightened consciousness, awakened consciousness, on the other hand, you could simply say does the opposite of that. It doesn't grasp on. When any of us steps into our higher self or our awakened self, we notice, I don't need to hold on to anything. In fact, life is much more interesting when it's just a fluid, it's just flowing, and I'm not really I'm not resisting anything. I'm willing to face everything, be with everything that is. I'm also not grasping to have and hold something. I'm an open, fluid, kind of conscious being. Now, could you practice that in meditation? Could you sit down for half an hour and practice not resisting anything that arises? So you make room for every possible experience that you could have in meditation, from the terrible to the sublime. And you guys have probably both done a lot of meditation, so you've probably experienced both extremes. Most of us have. And you make room for it all, and you don't hold on to the positive experiences. You don't grasp after subtle feelings of bliss. You don't try to sustain some intense clarity that you experience. You just let it all come and you let it all go with total ease and flow. That is I would argue that's a direct practice of being awake. If you can do that for half an hour, let's put it this way. If you can do that for a half an hour, it wasn't your ego that was doing it. It was your awakened self. Because I make the point that the only part of us, and it's part of why I call it direct awakening, the only part of us that can do a practice like that is awakened consciousness, which we all have access to all the time. In fact, I would argue it's the very consciousness that's hearing these words, that's listening to this podcast, that experiences everything you experience in your life. It is our true nature, our essence. So
Can I follow?
that's a, yeah, please.
Yeah,
That's a snapshot.
Very, very well articulated. I mean, I've been practicing TM for 50 years, and a lot of what you describe matches my experience. But I wanted to ask you something. You when you started out, you traveled the world and went to the East and was drawn to different traditions, and a value and maybe a problem with different traditions. And you sort of, as I understand it, look beyond that. And I'm wondering, you have students in 85 countries, you teach worldwide, and you must encounter people that are very connected to a tradition and people that are not connected to any tradition. And I'm going to guess it might be in some ways easier to teach those students that are not connected to a tradition than those that are connected to maybe a very spiritual tradition. And I just wanted your thoughts and reflections on that.
I would say, honestly, probably some kind of both and to that. Like, in other words, so here's where it's easier to teach to a non-traditional person, right? Is they're not carrying the baggage, they're not carrying the dogmas, they don't, traditional people can have a lot of fixed ideas. They were taught this way their whole life. The book says it's this way. And so, try to open that mind up and say, well, why don't you just try these techniques and see what they reveal in your experience and let go of all those old ideas. It can be, I think the point you're making is, well, that could be harder. The interesting thing, though, I found in my work about people who do have a traditional background, and even one they're very committed to, is often what they have that some of the folks in the other category don't, is often they have a very living connection to the sacred. They've got a sense of something bigger and something beyond. And that is something, and that enables them to really access a practice like this, maybe in a deeper way sometimes than somebody who's kind of more secular, doesn't have that intense relationship to the sacred. And now they're doing these techniques, and they're having these experiences, but they don't even have like there's a kind of reverence and a kind of almost devotional element often to let's call them religious people, let's say. And that powers the spiritual path, and it powers the path of awakening in a unique way. Go ahead.
Good question, yeah. Phil. And that is that, by that you mean that you may encounter somebody that has no connection to a tradition, and so they will practice so that they can, sleep better, or they can feel more relaxed during the day, whereas the person from the tradition may realize when they enter this, I'm in this for the big game. I'm in this because I want to reach full human potential, or however they might express it in their tradition.
Very nicely said. And let's talk about what the big game is for a second that you named, and what that difference is. Because see, another one of the, isn't it wonderful that so many people in the West and in the developed world, and even in a secular way, are now meditating and doing spiritual, doing yoga, meditating, doing these things? Isn't that, fantastic for the evolution of our planet? May that flourish and accelerate. But often the context in which people are doing these practices is even if, because you mentioned one end of the spectrum, like I'm just doing it to sleep, or I'm just doing it to improve my concentration or my performance at work, and that's kind of one end of the spectrum. But even, let's say, those who really they've read spiritual books for a long time, they've been maybe on some meditation retreats, they're more earnest, like they are seeking higher consciousness and enlightenment. But how to put it? What the religious person, and again, there are, like we're saying, there are advantages and disadvantages for all of us on the path. We all have our kind of strengths and weaknesses coming into the spiritual path. But one of the strengths that people who have stuck to a tradition and care about it and are passionate is often they have a sense that it's not about me and my self-fulfillment. It's not about even my enlightenment in the small sense. In other words, 'cause a lot of us approach enlightenment like, oh, that's like the ultimate pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You're happy and blissful all the time, and that's what life's about. And I want that. But the religious person often, you know, who's been religious, they're like, well, I know that even if I'm after my awakening, I'm after it for God or for the celestial illumination of all beings, or, you know, the liberation of the world from ignorance and suffering. And so it's often easier to connect with a higher, deeper context for our practice, which in my experience, where I'm really trying to teach people to awaken, that's everything, because you can't really do it for yourself. You can't, I'm sure you know, you can't really awaken for yourself. You can go a certain distance on the path, but the sacrifice that's required to wake up and to step into an awakening, you've got to leave your story behind. You got to leave your personal, this is me, I'm so important. That's got to go completely. And why would we make such a sacrifice of the thing that has been the center of our whole life? Well, maybe because we're in touch with a higher context, and that might enable it. So.
I wanted to get back to something you said earlier, but as long as we're here, in my experience, people who come from secular backgrounds, like I probably had a similar background to yours, only it was in the heart of the biggest city in the country, not the woods, or, you know, nature to me was the park down the, you know, a few blocks away. But I had no religious training whatsoever. So when I came to the path, I had certain things to unlearn. But I noticed that people who came from religious backgrounds, they had a different set of things to unlearn.
Right.
And different,
well said. Yeah.
different things to work out. Have you found that to be the case?
Well, yeah, absolutely makes sense. That's kind of, yeah, what I was just pointing to is that yeah, we have different, we were kind of speaking about the different strengths. Now you're speaking about the different, maybe struggles. And obviously for a person who's kind of more, I mean, you know, religions have told us how to live and what to do and how the cosmos is organized and what God is or the divine is, and, you know, fed us full of text of books about that and teaching. So all of that can get in the way of direct experience. I mean, any idea about what anything is gets in the way of a direct experience of it. If I'm sitting here talking to you two guys and I'm like, well, Phil's this, he's a, you know, spiritual philosopher, and Dennis, I don't know your whole background, but, you know, Dennis is this, and I've got rigid ideas about you. I'm not going to be here present to experience you. So, and kind of just encounter what your soul and your essence. Whereas, and the same is true for awakening. If I've got a bunch of big ideas about, how it all works and often the problem also in traditional context is the progression. The progression has been defined. You go to this step, and then you're ready for this step, and then it's this step, and then that step. And the budding student who starts to suddenly experience this step way up here gets told by the traditional teacher, no, it's beyond you. Just stay focused down here. And often might have been really catalyzed to something by that awakening they were having, but they're told they're not ready. So, you know, there are a lot of things like that in traditions, and I mean even traditional mysticism, that I think can get in the way of a more organic unfolding of our spiritual path. On the other side of it, what's the unlearning for the for the secular person? Well, it's kind of and I could speak to this in my own experience, even though I had a strong spiritual longing, and even though I've had a lifetime, you know, whatever, 40 years now of spiritual and religious experiences that have blown my mind to bits, I can still see that the pattern or the kind of template of a scientific atheistic worldview still is in my psyche. And I'll still kind of feel the tendency to disbelieve or to reduce, which of course is scientific modernism is so embedded in that. And I can see, that's still in my world. So that's something we have to unlearn to be open to a mystery that our mind can't know.
Yeah, I've often felt my the New York skepticism that I was raised in kept me from being too embroiled in a cult or anything like that. But it also can go into cynicism. and,
Sure.
and that could be a
Sure.
detriment. Dennis, can I
Go
go
ahead,
back
Phil.
to earlier? You were talking about an example of the direct path that in the forms of meditation you teach. And a lot of what you described sounds to me like very traditional in some traditions, some lineages,
Sure.
instructions for meditation,
Mm-hmm.
not being attached to the things that arise and so on and so forth. And it sounded like that, like meditation instructions, but framed in a slightly different way. And I found the framing of it as, you know, calling upon a quality of awakening as opposed to just here's how you do this. And that part is interesting. But would you agree that you're still, you know, you're teaching a method that
Well,
is
yeah, well, and let's even say, just to your bigger point about, hey, Craig, you didn't invent this. I want to be clear. I don't think I invented anything.
I wasn't
And
inferring
no, I
that,
know, but you know, to be honest, right?
yeah.
You know, I don't feel like I invented anything, but I do feel even like the kinds of direct teachings that I'm teaching in meditation in traditional contexts were only given to extremely advanced students. I would say that for the most part, they were not where you started. And there are good and, you know, there are kind of pros and cons to that because, you know, in many ways, a kind of direct path requires a lot from us. It requires a lot of discernment. It requires a lot of stability of kind of character and ability to be really present. Like it does demand a lot. And traditionally, the way you cultivated a lot of the things you need to be able to do a direct practice like this was to become a monk and go through all the rigors of education and learning and mind training and physical training and, you know, debate. There was a whole world that you would go through before they give you these, like in, say, Buddhism, like in Tibetan Buddhism, the Dzogchen or the Mahamudra teachings, which do resonate very much with what I'm talking about, for instance. But those were way, way up the chain. Now, I'm not alone in saying this. The Dalai Lama said the same thing that I'm about to say, which is that I believe that the kind of people who are, you know, in the Western world, the developed world, the, you know, educated world, whatever, who are getting onto the spiritual path already have a lot of what we might call the cognitive and emotional and maybe a moral development at a fairly high level that enables us to go straight to the direct path and do this. So, I would argue with the traditionalists. It was like, no, you got to do your 100,000 prostrations and your, you know, gazillion mantras and visualizations and everything else before we'll try to introduce the enlightened mind to you directly. But to get to what you had sorry, that I kind of answered the first half, but the specific question was, am I teaching a method? So yeah, it's a method, but I've actually spent a lot of time trying to talk about it not as a method. Because anytime we talk about a method, well, you know, even the idea of practice. I teach spiritual practice, but the moment we take up a practice orientation, what are we practicing for? The future. You know, we practice our violin for the, you know, to get better at it for the future. We practice, you know, our sport to get stronger and more agile and limber so we can perform in the competition. We practice for the future. And anytime we're practicing for the future, we're missing the main event, which is already happened. It's the consciousness that's already here right now, but revealed in its essence because we looked at it. We made ourselves available to it. So,
very good.
yes,
You're
method
hitting on
and
a lot
no
of the
method.
beautiful.
Both.
No, you're touching on a lot of the beautiful paradoxes of the path.
Great.
Are
I
beautiful.
have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Phil. So I have another appointment, but and it's a follow up on what you were just saying, I think, and that is that you've been teaching for a number of years. The students that are coming to you now, are there goals? Do you see a change from what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, however long you've been teaching? And have you seen, or do you think it's reflective of, if there is a change in the global or collective consciousness in the world?
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I would say, yeah, things are changing. And I was just talking about this with a friend yesterday, that, when I was a spiritual seeker and doing a lot of my intensive spiritual work, and even when I started teaching, this whole East meets West spiritual kind of convergence was still a very dominant context for spiritual seeking, meaning a lot of people were still very oriented to Vedanta and Buddhism and, Kashmir Shaivism, whatever, many different kinds of Indian things that arose from India really was widespread. And in that context, people were seeking self-realization, enlightenment, God realization. That was an active thought. I'm trying to pursue that because that's what I've read about in the books. And that's, and I've had an experience. I went to a satsang with the enlightened guru and I had a deep experience. And that's like the context for my work. I would say that East meets West, Eastern context seems to be fading from center stage in the kind of world of people doing spiritual practice and seeking. It's becoming, I wouldn't necessarily say more secular. I mean, maybe it probably is becoming more secular just because of, meditations now getting pushed out by apps on your phone, and it is getting mainstream. So it probably is drawing in more people from a kind of secular orientation. But so I would say that's one thing, is that context seems to be shifting to just a more like, I want to live a good life. I want to live a full human life. And I feel that spirituality seems like a big, important part of that. And so I want to do that too. And I want to become better. And so I want to do that. So there's that. But to what you're asking, I would also say that there are a lot more people who have done a lot more spiritual practice now than there were 20 years ago. They've done 20 years more spiritual practice, right? And so I do find more what I would call kind of very spiritually mature students showing up who've really done a lot of work. I don't know how many times I hear people say, oh, I've done, 10, month-long retreats, and this work just blew my mind, or whatever. I get this kind of excited people because somehow I penetrated something direct for them that was they weren't getting from all the traditional stuff. So there are a couple.
We have
nice to meet you, Dennis. I guess you're leaving.
Nice meeting you.
Okay.
And, Dennis, we'll talk to you later.
I would love to do a Phil, and turn it over to you, but I would love to do a follow-up interview because there's a lot more we could get into for sure. So
right.
Thank you very much.
Let's do it.
See you, Dennis.
Have a good evening.
So, Craig, in the 2-3 minutes we have left, once upon a time there was a magazine called What is Enlightenment, and you were involved with it. I want to ask you, if you're
talking about the ancient history before the internet.
Right, a magazine with
a
paper.
Magazine, it was printed and sold in stores. Yeah, go ahead.
The name of the magazine is still a question. And my question to you...
No, I've answered it, Phil. Didn't I just answer it completely?
No, I want the answer. No, my question is, and I know you need more time, but in a couple of minutes, how do you feel now about the question itself, and whether there is such a thing that has been called enlightenment? Is it the same thing as what you're calling awakening, or others call realization? Is there an end state to the evolution of consciousness or not? How have you come to see these
that's great. It's
minor issues?
It's a wonderful question to end on too. So I again find myself saying yes and no. So like, as you're intimating, this is an enormous question that could be the beginning of an hour-long conversation. So, but to try to get right to the essence, I think I would say that let's first take the yes, there is an enlightened consciousness and what you're calling end state, like a real goal. Let's just call it, whether it's an end state exactly, because I'm going to also say why it's not an end state, but
Okay, you got 2
even a
minutes.
beginning state. But let's say there's a beginning state called enlightened consciousness, but that it's completely different than unenlightened consciousness, and that there is a radical shift that we can make into a completely different experience of being alive and a completely different way of living. And by that, I mean a different relationship to our mind, a different relationship to our feelings, a different set of motivations arising from something beyond us, compelling us in the world, completely subverting the ordinary structure of ego motives and instinctual motives that drive human behavior, and that takes over the organism, and we become a living, breathing, passionate expression of something infinite that we can't even understand or know with our minds, but that infuses us, fills us with love and passion for higher evolution and spreading the potential for this possibility. And because it's really it's the goal of human life, it's the highest possible human potential, and if it could spread widely enough, it would completely change the world, because it would eradicate the short-term self-interested personal motivation that is kind of wrecking everything. So enlightenment in that sense, I would say, absolutely exists, and it's a real possibility.
Okay. Now you
Is
have
it an end
30
state?
seconds for the but.
But is it an end state? No, it's not an end state. It's a state that then opens us to what? To continue to no longer be in the way of evolution. So you've gotten out of the way. So now your life can begin to flow, and you can easily adapt and evolve and grow and expand. And so you're on a constant journey of unfolding of goodness, truth, and beauty and love into the world, but it's never ending, and it's not an end state. So
Sounds great. You did it perfectly.
There you go.
Craig, we have so much more we could talk about. We'll have you back on the show. Thanks for being with us. Everybody,
Thanks for having me.
Google Craig Hamilton, Craig Hamilton Global, and we'll have all this on the website. And thanks for being with us. It's
Thanks
been
so
a
much
joy.
for having me. Take
care.
Bye-bye.
Phil, that was Craig Hamilton. Very, very knowledgeable guy. Obviously been at this for about 40 years, has had multiple experiences worldwide. And, who am I to judge? But I thought he was a very balanced, healthy, happy guy.
Well,
which is always a good sign.
So he seemed.
I wonder what people think of us. Yeah, but go ahead.
God knows what they think of us. Everybody's complicated, but I always enjoyed Craig's company. I've known him for a long time, and I think one of the things that I like you, I value in spiritual teachers is when they're real and grounded and human, and Craig fits the description. Yeah, he's got quite an operation going.
What he teaches, would it be in the category of wakefulness? What is that popular movement in the meditation world? Awakening,
well, yeah,
mindfulness.
No, not mindful. I hate categorizing people who have an integrative and holistic approach to spirituality, which is the kind of thing Craig mentions. If you're thinking of the Neo-Advaita non-dual people, if you look at what he's teaching and the sort of philosophical or intellectual framework of it, you would probably fit it into that category of non-dualism. But he has his approach, and the critique of a lot of the non-dual people who are um, had had a tendency to disconnect from the world, and think that everything, methods
Right.
and teachings are useless, and you just have to sort of
He's not
snap
in
out
that
of it.
boat.
I would not put him in that boat.
Okay.
No,
I
he's
wanted
always
to
been
ask
in the
you,
world.
yeah, I wanted to ask what you thought about, he talked about people, coming from traditions, like I would assume
Yeah,
India, but that part of the world, and they have a preconceived notion, which may be a very good thing, about spirituality. So on the one hand, they approach it with more reverence. On the other
yeah,
hand,
it's interesting.
they may be harder to teach. I mean, my experience was when I was in India involved with TM, if I mentioned meditation to anybody, they would always say, "Oh, we know all about it. My
Yeah,
uncle
yeah,
and me,
yeah,
my family," and they did know things, but often they were different than what I might have been speaking about, or what their friends might have been speaking about. But it made it a little bit more difficult. It's like everybody felt like they knew all about it. Whereas in the West, especially back when I was first teaching meditation, like in the 70s, it was new to everybody. So they just,
yeah.
if they were interested, you had their full attention and they absorbed it like a sponge.
Well, I think both of things are true. I mean, I've gone to India many times. Uh, you meet different people, and there are highly secular people who think all this spirituality stuff from their heritage that we value so much, they think it's bull. They think it's just old superstition and useless, and they're just secular people in the world. There are intellectuals, often with Marxist training, who just reject the whole thing and are opposed to it and think it's been terrible for India. And of course, the bulk of everyday people have a deep, spiritual tendency and what we think of as a religious life. But most of them are bhaktas. They don't necessarily have a meditation practice or a yoga practice. They do rituals, they do pujas, and all that. So techniques like meditation are new to some people in the traditional world. So I mean, this stuff is complicated. And I think what Craig was referring to is people in the West who had been with gurus, who had studied Vedanta, are yogis, have gone on meditation retreats, maybe, been with a spiritual lineage for a long time. That's a different kind of thing than people in India, for example, or many people in India, but very different from somebody coming to it from a purely secular, or like you and I were 50 years ago. It was like, we don't know anything. We just suddenly, started reading Alan Watts and
Right.
hearing
All
about
new.
the Beatles going to India, and we said, give me some of that. I want that. And so that's
Right.
very different from somebody, even in those days, who might have been, deeply immersed in something.
I also, I'm trying to remember if Craig was mentioned in your book, American Veda.
Did I mention him by name? I can't.
Or
I'll have to look it up. I
so I'm not
knew
the only
him
one that
then.
didn't
No,
remember.
that's how I met him, when I was
Yeah. Researching.
researching American Veda.
Right.
We mentioned in our interview briefly, or maybe it was after you left, the magazine What is Enlightenment, which had a good run for several years, and Craig was the editor of that for some
Oh, really?
time. So that's when, I mean, that was a long time ago, but that's when I first met him, and then he left there and started, teaching on his own and stuff. But I thought that magazine did a very good job of sorting out, in good journalistic fashion, a lot of the issues that our generation of seekers especially were wrestling with, and were trying, and learning about back in I get my decades mixed up now,
Yeah.
but it was probably the 80s and 90s for the most part, into the new century probably. But so yeah, so I think Craig has always had a well-rounded and insightful approach to his work. I'm saying that just without in-depth knowledge. I've
Right.
never taken his online courses or his programs, but he's taught and reached, you know, thousands of people, and has made has developed quite
Right.
a
But
good
the other thing that
reputation.
comes out is that when people use the word meditation, it can mean many, many things. Like I mentioned, I
Yes,
mean,
indeed.
I've been involved with TM for 50 years, and TM was always about going inward, transcending. That was the emphasis. I think it's like he was mentioning, having an innocent awareness and letting things just flow, not associating it with meaning or feeling or whatever, and that mindfulness. And so when you hear the word, for people that are new at this, when you hear the word meditation,
Yeah.
it can mean a lot of contemplation, concentration, all of those things get put under one umbrella.
And now
And,
mindfulness, it's all, they mix them up. But
yeah,
what, you know, coming back to Craig, what Craig was talking about, that was an example he gave. I would not leap to the
right,
conclusion that what he was
no,
speaking about was what he teaches. It's just
right,
one element. It was an example to answer one of our questions. But what was interesting is the way he framed it, and that kind of non-doing
right,
and effortlessness that he was describing sounded very much like the instructions in techniques like TM, and
right.
I say like because there are others that are similar, where, you know, mind control and the involvement of the, you know, the personality and the ego and everything is, you know, just relaxed.
Right. Yeah, the other
And
thing he brought out is there are teachers there, and I think of Swami Satchidananda, who was very much a traditionalist, as I understand it, from speaking to his students. Whereas first you go to step one, then step two, then step three, then step four.
interesting.
You go up the ladder, and everybody follows the same path step by step. Whereas Craig was saying, you know, I think that's okay sometimes, but other times somebody's ready to go here, or they're here and they have an experience here, and we have to guide them that way. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yes, and think of this. Now, I don't know if that's true of Satchidananda, but what I thought of when Craig was saying that was that some of the gurus who came here, the most famous ones, including Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who we studied with, including Yogananda,
Right.
they too did that and departed from tradition. Because it's true, in certain lineages, it's a big process. You do this, and later you can do this, and then you're eligible for that, and then you learn this.
And you have to renounce the rest of the world.
Well,
In some
that's,
cases,
well, if you're a monk,
another ball of wax.
yes, but
Right.
that doesn't apply to everybody. I mean, that's only for a few people.
But aren't there some lineages where only monks, only those that are recluse, get these
Get
techniques?
certain practices.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And people like Yogananda and Maharshi, and maybe some of the others, they said, no, you know, this stuff should be available to not only to everybody, but Maharshi used to use the term highest first.
Right.
And so he was the meditation practice that we call TM, just like certain of Yogananda's teachings that were, and they took flack for teaching these things to anybody who wanted it. And their take on it was, no, these have been misinterpreted. These are practical methods that people can use, and the other things come along as well. But at the same time, certain things were taught for a while, and then you became eligible to take an advanced technique. Now, I don't know if that's true of Craig. Certain things he's teaching right off the bat that he calls direct path. And I think some of the gurus from India did the same thing. At the same time, there were prerequisites for learning more advanced things. So it gets
Right.
complicated.
Interesting. Well, I think he was a fascinating guy. I'd like to have him back on.
Yeah.
And again, you know, when you interview a lot of people, and especially if they're talking about spiritual development, you often notice how they are and how they're feeling and how they interact. And he seemed like a terrific guy, as do all our guests.
All of our guests are wonderful human beings.
And on that subject, sort of, for those who would like to see us continue and keep our archives open and available to everyone everywhere, and they want to directly help, you can contribute. We have, we're not a nonprofit, I should mention, it's not a donation, but we want to thank those people that have contributed and helping us to stay on the air. And if you go to spiritmatterstalk.com, that is our website. We have almost 300 shows archived there. Anybody can go, and we want to keep it that way, free and open to all. But if you want to contribute, it certainly would help.
And look, now we've upgraded the technology, so now you can actually see us. And this this requires us to get dressed. And
yeah, as a matter of fact, if you notice, this shirt is slightly different than the shirt I wore in the interview.
Me too. I don't look. That's right.
Yeah,
we actually took a break
there are
in
people
between.
That may notice that I wore the same sweater. All right.
So we want to upgrade all this, folks. So thanks for your help. Okay, Dennis. See you next time.